Hello and welcome everyone to Staying on Track for College Readiness. My name is Rachel Berger. I'm the Technical Assistance Lead with the Oregon College and Career Readiness Research Alliance at REL Northwest. This is part 2 of the webinar series, Developing Savvy Students for College and Career Readiness. This webinar is co-hosted by REL Northwest and REL Northeast and Islands. Just a couple of quick reminders. Please introduce yourself in the chat window. The phones will be muted during the presentation, so all questions and introductions, comments should be entered in the chat window. Today's event will be recorded and available for viewing on the REL Northwest website. We're very excited today to have two wonderful presenters. Jenny Nagaoka, Deputy Director of the University of Chicago Consortium on Chicago School Research, and Dr. Susan Fairchild, Director, Data Analysis and Applied Research for New Visions Public Schools. Again, throughout the presentation, we want to invite you to ask questions by typing them into the chat window. We'll select representative questions to pose to the presenters after each presentation as well as during the closing of the event. While we won't be able to answer all questions, we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible.
Good morning, everybody. If you're on Pacific time, good morning. My name is Jacqueline Raphael, and I'm the Alliance Lead for the Oregon College and Career Readiness Research Alliance. And I'm here to give you a little bit of background. REL Northwest is one of 10 regional educational laboratories across the nation, each serving a region of the country. Our REL serves 5 states, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Alaska. And as many of you may know, the purpose of that regional educational laboratory program is to build the research capacity and knowledge of the states and districts in their region. This work that we do is funded by the Institute of Education Sciences at the Department of Education, and it comes in 5-year cycles and contracts. In this particular contract, we are focusing on working in what we call research alliances, which are groups of policymakers and practitioners who need research and data and evidence to address real problems that they're trying to solve and that they're confronting in a real way. So it's very practical, important work, and we're very excited about it. Our alliance is one of 9 here at REL Northwest. It includes representatives from Oregon's 3 key education sectors, K-12, the community colleges, and the 4-year colleges, as well as members of the governor's office and college and district leaders. The goals of our alliance are to focus on bringing research and evidence to bear on how we understand and operationalize college and career readiness and how we use information to make decisions that foster improved alignment between and across the entire system, K-12, actually pre-K through college. Our alliance is focused in its first year on 2 strands of work. One is looking at developmental education as a potential gap in the pipeline, and looking at the other strand is dual credit and other early college programs as well as AP and IB programs. And in both areas, we're looking at how we can bring research and evidence to bear to help folks think about these gaps and opportunities in the pipeline. This event, as Rachel mentioned, is being co-sponsored with REL Northeast and Islands, which also has a research alliance focused on college and career readiness. We've very much enjoyed working with our sister alliance, our sister REL. REL Northeast and Islands hosted the first part of this 2-part series on May 30th. The event focused on proficiency-based teaching and learning and can be viewed at the event archive address at the bottom of this slide. As Rachel mentioned, today's event will also be archived. We're building on what we talked about last time, looking at how measures can be combined and used to quantify and determine college readiness. Today's event will also be archived, and the link will be sent to you by email if you registered for this event. And my last point, after this event, there will be, for those of you who registered, an email in your inbox with a survey. It's not too long, and it's extremely important and helpful that our funder gets feedback about events such as these. So I hope that you'll be able to respond. Thank you.
So today we're going to have a short amount of time at the end of each presentation for questions and answers from our participants. Again, we'll also have an additional chunk of time for discussion between our presenters as well as Q&A. So please type those questions and comments in the chat room whenever you have them, and we'll facilitate answering those questions during the Q&A time. We're really excited about today's event. It focuses on really the essential aspects of our Alliance's work by examining how and what to measure for progress towards the goal of college and career readiness. There's currently a great deal of national work and attention in this area, and we're just beginning to understand the complexities of this work and developing tools which schools and educational institutions can use to support students at all levels. We want to begin by asking our participants a couple of questions, really to provide context to our presenters. First, let us know which region of the country that you are primarily working in, the Northwest, West, Pacific, Central, etc. Thank you. I see a lot of people responding already. Good variety here. We've got representation from Northwest, West, as well as Northeast and Islands, Midwest, Mid-Atlantic, Appalachia. Wonderful diversity. Thank you so much. Our next poll question, I'm sorry, we're going to post the results for you to see. And we have a couple more coming in. Again, please go ahead and let us know what region of the country you're participating from today. The information is really helpful to us and our presenters to give context. So there you can see we've got great representation from multiple areas, Northwest and West, Southeast, the Appalachia, Mid-Atlantic, Northeast and Islands. Great diversity. Thank you for answering that question. And next up, if you could please share with us your primary role in the organization where you work, elementary, secondary teacher, post-secondary faculty, school or district administration. Again, this information is really helpful to provide context to our presenters. Thank you. I see a lot of people coming in from the research area. Great to see a lot of teachers joining us and post-secondary faculty. Good deal of representation from school district administration as well. Great. So it looks like you'll see the results posted in just a couple of seconds. We have a real diversity of roles today. Many teachers, post-secondary faculty members, school and district administrators, researchers, representatives from state governments, and our nonprofits as well. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Our first presenter for today is Jenny Nagaoka, Deputy Director of the Chicago Consortium. Ms. Nagaoka has conducted research on policy and practice in urban education reform for over 15 years. She focused her research specifically on developing school environments and instructional practices that promote college readiness and success. She'll provide an overview of college indicator research today, current research and practices, and we'll discuss the challenges of developing and implementing the CRIS tool. Welcome and thank you for being here, Ms. Nagaoka.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So today I'm going to be talking about effective indicators, and I'm going to actually be starting out using a specific example of work that the Consortium on Chicago School Research and the Chicago Public Schools has been working on. This is actually the work that we've been doing on the on-track indicator. In a lot of ways has been going on for over 15 years, and I think this has really taught us a lot in thinking about what an effective indicator actually is. And I think one of the big lessons that we've taken away from all of our work with the Chicago Public Schools is the fact that a lot of what actually makes an effective indicator is not just about finding the best possible indicator, but you really have to be embedded in thinking about how it's being used, how this is actually part of a larger data system, and really thinking a lot about how data is being used across the district and particularly within schools. So this has a lot to tell us about kind of moving on to a topic that I've been doing a lot of thinking about more recently with college readiness indicators. So I think we've learned a lot from our work on the on-track indicator, but as I'll talk to you a lot more later on, really thinking about what makes for an effective college readiness indicator is considerably more complicated than figuring out a good predictor of high school graduation. So I've been working on thinking about what actually makes kids have better access to college and what makes them successful once there for probably about the past 7 or 8 years. More recently, my work has been focused on college readiness, and particularly college readiness indicators, through work that has been funded by the Gates Foundation in partnership with the John Gardner Center at Stanford and Brown University's Annenberg Institute for School Reform. So I just want to give you a little bit of background on the Consortium on Chicago School Research in case you don't know about us. So we're based at the University of Chicago, and we've been doing research on the Chicago Public Schools. We actually had some debate about this yesterday where depending on how you count it, our 25th anniversary is either next year or the year after that. So we've actually spent a lot of time really getting to know the Chicago Public Schools, and we see our role as providing the practitioners and policymakers in Chicago and across the nation with insights that really help them do their work more effectively. So our role is not just to be the answer people. We really see ourselves in partnership with the Chicago Public Schools and helping them really figure out what the solutions are to the problems that they face. And we really see ourselves in the role of building the capacity of schools to address their problems more effectively. And we have a lot of different types of research that we do and different types of activities. One of the big things that we spend a lot of time doing is thinking about what are the answers and what actually matters for student success and school improvement. So in the case of thinking about high school graduation, we can realize that the transition to high school is a critical juncture in students' academic careers. And so this is a part that actually matters a great deal. And through that, we also want to have indicators so we can actually chart what it is actually happening around these things that our research has determined matter for school success, for student success and school improvement. So the on-track indicator is an example of this. We also spend a lot of time thinking about frameworks because indicators help us measure it. We can figure out what matters, but unless it's actually connected to a larger sense about what's happening. So we've done work, for example, with the 5 essential supports for school organization that has really helped schools think about what they can be working on to help them be more effective. And finally, a big part of our work is about communication. So we do high-level research and we do publish in academic journals, but in many ways we really see our primary audience as being the people doing the work in schools and across the district. So it becomes really important for us to take our findings and make sure that we're communicating them in ways that are really accessible to the more general public audience, as well as not just having them be kind of esoteric research findings, but really translating them into something that becomes much more actionable in the real world. So we spend a lot of time thinking about how we put together our publications. We spend a lot of time doing presentations, kind of like what I'm doing now. And another thing that we've spent a lot of time doing is putting together individual school reports. So we'll actually take our research findings and use the indicators that we've developed and then create reports for schools that give them their specific standing on how they look on indicators, break it down by different subgroups, and show comparisons about how they are doing versus the rest of the district. And so this is a way for schools to actually see what our research means for what's happening inside of the building. So I'm going to be talking to you today about the on-track indicator. And as I mentioned, this is something that we've been working on since the 1990s, and in many ways this goes back to Melissa Roderick, who's one of our directors, work in her dissertation. So it's something that people around us have been thinking about for a long time. So in the 1990s, we had a report called The Students Speak that was looking at what was going on inside of high schools that was causing students to be dropping out. And one of the things that became really clear through this work was how ninth grade was a pivotal point for students as they were making a transition into a new setting. And so when kids were failing their classes in ninth grade, this was something that was really difficult for them to overcome. So as we were thinking about this, we realized that, well, we can sort of tell schools that ninth grade is really important, course failure is a bad thing. That's not necessarily the sort of insight that's really going to help them change their practice or actually see if they're improving on working with kids as they're transitioning into high schools. So we developed the on-track indicator. So the on-track indicator is an indicator of whether or not students have failed no more than one semester course in ninth grade and that they've actually accrued at least 5 full-year credits by the end of ninth grade, which would enable them to be promoted into 10th grade. So we had this indicator. We actually we're looking at the general relationship to graduation. It seemed like this was a good way to measure whether or not kids were likely to graduate. Later on, we produced more work around validation, and then at the end, on the far right, that's an example of an individual school report that we've produced around the on-track indicator. So through this, as I mentioned, it really has made us think a lot about what makes for an effective indicator. So one of the things why we feel that on-track has been really successful is that it's really addressing a problem that is a high priority for district leadership as well as leadership within schools and for teachers and everybody else, for students and parents as well. So this is something that everybody can agree upon, that high school graduation is an important thing to be thinking about. So when Arne Duncan became CEO, he put together an education plan which laid out what the priorities were for his administration. And in 2001, one of the things that the education plan noted and sort of saw as a big problem facing the district was the fact that 40% of 13-year-olds were not completing high school by the time they were 19. So it was really, really clear that dropping out was a serious issue inside of the district. And so the Duncan administration was looking for ways to improve on the graduation rate. So one of the things, as they were looking around and trying to find ways to work on high school graduation, because we were working closely with the Duncan administration, they noticed the fact that we had developed this on-track indicator, and so it became a part of the accountability system. So on-track kind of went from this esoteric indicator based on our research to something that schools were being told that they really needed to pay attention to. In some ways, this was kind of exciting because now our work was actually becoming a part of what was happening inside the district, and it was being used. But the kind of alarming part of this was that we actually hadn't done any sort of real validation of this indicator. So, one of the things after the on-track indicator became a part of the accountability system is that we became, this is actually when John Easton was the executive director of the consortium, is that he was very concerned because the on-track indicator was out there, schools were being held accountable for it, we had developed it, but we actually were not sure about whether or not it was a strong predictor of high school graduation. And fortunately for everybody involved, it turned out that it actually, what we had done is, as preliminary analysis, and when we actually did a more rigorous analysis, it actually turned out to be very predictive of high school graduation. So when we look at kids who were on track at the end of 9th grade, 81% of them had graduated within 4 years versus only 22% of kids who had been off track at the end of 9th grade. And then these numbers kind of grow a little bit when we look at five-year graduation rates. But when we looked at this, it became clear that on track was a really useful tool to be thinking about in terms of identifying who was likely to graduate and who was not. So that was encouraging, although I think one of the first reactions that a lot of people had when they saw this is like, okay, so you've got this fancy on-track indicator. Isn't this the same thing as test scores? I mean, I can probably look at a kid's test scores at the end of 8th grade and have a pretty good pretty good sense about who is going to graduate and who is not. So one of the other pieces of this work was making sure that the on-track indicator was actually telling us something that information that schools already had was not. So we took a closer look at how on-track and test scores were breaking down. So this is kind of a somewhat complicated figure, and it's looking at the probability of students graduating. So on the far left side are kids whose 8th grade achievement was in the bottom quartile, and on the right is the top quartile. So at the bottom quartile, only 42% of the students were on track. But if you look at what happened of the students who came in with low 8th grade test scores but were actually on track at the end of 9th grade, 68% of them had graduated 4 years later. When we look at the other end of the spectrum, at the top quartile, and the students who were off track, only 37% of them had graduated 4 years later. So when we look at this, it really becomes clear that how kids were performing in their classes and whether or not they had actually passed them was actually telling us something that just looking at their test scores did not. Another reason why the on-track indicator has been really useful in the district is the fact that it's malleable. It's something that school practitioners can actually change. So when Ari Duncan first made high school graduation a priority, the conversation was really, really different. When we talked to principals and to teachers, and we asked, what can you do about preventing kids from dropping out of high school, they generally went to things that are kind of at the extreme. They talked a lot about gang violence. They talked about teenage pregnancy. They talked about that kids were coming from really dysfunctional homes, all of which are serious issues, but those are largely things that are external to the school. So one of the things that was really useful about the on-track indicator was that it actually brought the problem of dropping out into something that was under the control of people within the school. So when we put together all kinds of different demographic information, including tests, 8th grade test scores, whether or not kids had changed schools in elementary school, whether or not they were old for grade. We looked at race, ethnicity. We looked at various SES factors. We were only able to predict who was going to graduate in 4 years with 65% accuracy. And that is compared to just taking the on-track indicator, which is at 80%. And then when we combine all of those, it only goes up 1% to 81%. So just this one little indicator on track is actually telling us a lot more than all kinds of different pieces of information about students and how they look going into high school. And so all of these other things were the things that high schools really had no control over. You can't really do anything about 8th grade achievement. You can hope that you're increasing achievement, but you actually can't change the fact that there are going to be kids coming into high school who are low achieving. And really had them focus on something that was much more under the control of high school. So they can really look at the kids who are coming in to their buildings and start thinking about what can we do to help them? What can we actually do to help make sure that these kids are passing their classes? And it really transformed the sorts of conversations that were going on across the city about what you can do to prevent high school dropout. So finally, the other piece that was really important about the on-track indicator was the fact that it was a concept that was pretty easily communicated and that practitioners actually had some strategies for what they might be able to do to have more kids pass their classes. So one of the other follow-ups that we had to the original on-track report was thinking about what actually mattered and what actually predicted high school graduation besides on track, and what actually predicted when that kids were going to be on track in 9th grade. And one of the things that that really stood out was the role of absences in making sure that kids were passing their classes and ultimately whether or not they were going to graduate from high school. So in this figure, we're looking at the number of days kids were absent in one semester. And we also included course cutting, and we added that up to eventually become a full day if they had cut enough classes. So if you look at students who had been absent less than a week per semester, 87% of them graduated. And that's compared to 63% of students who have been absent for over a week and around between 1 and 2 weeks, between 1 and 2 weeks of school in each semester. So the difference of just a few days of school actually told us a lot about who was likely to graduate and who was not. So really starting to pay attention to whether or not kids were coming to school and whether or not they were going to classes really became something that teachers and principals started paying a lot more attention to, and they were not seeing it as just something that it was actually something that was related to an outcome that they cared about, and they were starting to organize themselves around the idea that it was important for kids to be coming to school. But another thing that the district did in 2008, which was just after the What Matters report came out, was that they developed online early warning reporting systems that were set up to help schools identify who was at risk of, to identify who was at risk of falling on track. So this was taking different characteristics that kids had prior to 9th grade, and so schools could take a look and see who they should be paying additional attention to make sure that they were passing their classes. In addition to this, they also put together a system where that identified kids who were failing at 5 weeks, looking at their absence rates. So there's a lot of information that was being gathered after students had started 9th grade. So a teacher could log in, see who was failing, see if a kid was failing not just their class, but other classes, and really start thinking about what was happening to cause kids to not be doing well in their classes. The Chicago Public Schools also put together a series of credit recovery reports, which were for upperclassmen, and that system flagged students who were behind in the number of credits that they were going to need in order to graduate. So what happened with all of this? So the Chicago Public Schools put together a lot of effort. Initially, it was focused around accountability. Later on, they really started focusing on this data systems to help schools think about on track. So one of the things that we see is that this is showing on track rates across the district from 2003 to 2011. Accountability went in around 2003, and we see that actually not a whole lot happened for quite a while. That accountability, I think, was initially how people were thinking a lot about how do you actually use something like an indicator. So is it sort of being held more on a punitive sense? That actually did not seem to do a whole lot to change on-track rates across time. In fact, we sort of see this little dip initially. But where we actually start to see really big increases in on-track rates was when the Chicago Public Schools put together these data systems that was giving schools ways to actually engage in this problem, see which kids were struggling, which kids who are at risk of falling off track. And this is really a place where the power of data became more apparent because initially it didn't seem like just providing information would be enough, but the data that the district was providing was helping teachers be thinking about a problem more systematically than they had in the past. So before, when we talked to teachers about this, they had been concerned about course failure, they had been concerned about absences, but they really didn't have a good way of thinking about the big picture about what's happening with students. And then when they actually had these online systems, they were able to see the big picture about and the patterns of behavior that students were having. And so that really made a huge difference in what was happening. So why was this effective? One of the really important pieces about this was the fact that this is a problem that was a high priority in schools. It was a high priority for the district, but it was something that principals and teachers were really struggling with. And the data systems that were developed were really set up not just to provide a whole slew of information, but it was really targeted for people to be solving something that they were already trying to do. So it was a way for people to actually do their job more effectively as opposed to just being one more thing that's on the long list that principals and teachers have to be trying to incorporate in their daily work lives. So I think one of the other exciting pieces of this is that it really started changing how people were thinking about a problem. Data, as much as I love data, data is not the magic solution that's going to solve all your problems, and immediately you look at the data, you've got more information, suddenly you know exactly why a kid's failing or why a kid's not coming to school. But it really gave a good start for practitioners to start to think about, okay, so Johnny has been absent, seems to be absent on Mondays and Fridays. What's going on? This seems to be different than being absent all the time, or is Mary absent just first period? And so maybe it's more of a problem of not being able to get up in the morning. So if she's missing her first period algebra class, sending her to algebra tutoring is probably not going to be the solution to not getting up in the morning. So it really helped practitioners engage in the problem based on better information. So this is kind of related to what I was just saying, but before, the idea of trying to address the problem of dropout seemed really, really overwhelming to people. You know, there are so many factors that go into why kids drop out. How do you actually even begin to address it without creating these large systems that are involving, you know, community support, figuring out ways to prevent teenage pregnancy, trying to reduce gang violence. You know, all of those continue to be problems, but the fact that now practitioners had leverage points that were within their school really changed how they were thinking about it and the sorts of strategies that they were using to do something about course failure and school attendance. And finally, there was just a lot of feedback that was going on, and the data was really something that was actionable. Schools could take a look at it and start to think about what they might be able to do about the fact that a kid was absent, which is much easier than trying to solve all kinds of different factors that are external to schools. So that's kind of the work that has been going on for quite a while. This is like another part of my life that I've been doing a lot of thinking about, as I mentioned, for like the past 7 or 8 years. I'm thinking about college readiness and how do we actually help more students enroll in college and also make sure that they're graduating from college. And so at CCSR, we've had a series of reports. We started out really trying to think about the academic factors that that are barriers to college access and college graduation. We've also done a lot of work thinking about on the support side, so what are the barriers that kids have in the college enrollment process. And we've also done a lot of work around ACT. There are actually more reports in this series, but don't want to fill up the screen too much just talking about other stuff. So what can we learn from this experience that's gone on with the on-track indicator that's really going to help us think about college readiness? Because I think one of the things that really strikes me about college readiness is just how much more complex it is than trying to figure out how to get more kids to be on track so that they're graduating from high school. And maybe this is just the way it is when you don't know what to do, because I think this is how people felt about high school dropout in Chicago 10 or 15 years ago, like where do you actually begin? So one of the things about college readiness is that it's something that people are talking about across the country. All kinds of districts and states and schools and everybody is really trying to figure out college readiness. So there's this huge appetite for improving college readiness, but I think in many ways we really have not gotten a handle on what this means, because I think it's so much more complicated. Because one of the things we really care about making sure that we're developing indicators that are predictive, but what actually makes I think this sort of work hard is we don't actually know for sure what our outcome is. And it's kind of hard to do a good analysis if you're not positive about what the outcome that you're trying to actually predict is. Because I think there's a lot of work that's been looking at college readiness in terms of college enrollment. A lot of people talk about college readiness in terms of whether or not kids are able to enroll and pass credit-bearing courses. College graduation is clearly the ultimate goal. Then the other wrinkle that goes on with higher ed is that there's just so many different types of colleges. What it takes to be ready at a local community college is really different than what it would mean to be college ready at an elite school. It also is really different about what it's going to take to be successful if you're going to a small liberal arts school versus going to a large state university. And that's above and beyond just academic qualification. It's something that is, the complexities of what is going on in higher ed are quite a bit different than what's happening in high schools. And then there's this whole idea about, what does on track to college readiness mean? We want kids to be college ready, but where does this actually stand at different grade levels? This is actually something that Susan has done a lot of great work on and will be showing you a bit about in the next presentation. So another thing that's really important is that we're actually getting information that's above and beyond other characteristics. So one of the things that I think there's been a lot of work thinking about college readiness indicators in terms of test scores, but I'll show you some other work around this. But is that test scores are quite often not providing us more information than what we would know from demographics. They provide some more information, but they're not necessarily the most predictive. So that calls into question some about what we should be doing there. So another really big question is around this whole idea of malleability. Are the different college readiness indicators that we're considering, are these actually things that schools can change? Are there actually strategies for improvement? We can talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but one of the things that, as you may guess from how I'm talking, is I'm kind of skeptical of test scores playing this role. Because in Chicago, there's been a tremendous amount of effort to try to improve ACT scores for the past 10 years, and we've seen an increase of 1 point. Now, it's good to see progress, but that's not a lot of payoff for a lot of work that's been done within schools by teachers and students, and a lot of resources being put forth by the district. So it made me start to wonder, like, how malleable are test scores really? So that's kind of like where I come to from thinking about the on-track work and what that's really, the questions that it raises for me around college readiness. And the work that CCSR has been doing with the Annenberg Institute and the Gardner Center, we're thinking about college readiness indicator systems, and we've split the idea of college readiness into 3 different dimensions. And I think this is kind of a really useful way of getting past, or really kind of encompassing a lot of what we actually would want from our college readiness indicator systems. We sort of set these up as being 3 different dimensions, but as I'm sure it's pretty clear from looking at them, and as I will show you in a minute, these are really interrelated. So a lot of times, traditionally when we're thinking about college readiness, we're focused a lot around this idea of academic preparation. Test scores, GPA, what courses students take. I mean, all of these things are clearly important for college readiness. But just those things alone are not really what's going to make a student be successful once they're on a college campus. There's a lot that goes on with this concept of academic tenacity. In our work at the consortium, we refer to a lot of these same ideas as non-cognitive factors. So above and beyond just what you know and what you can do, things like having strategies for actually engaging in learning, being able to organize yourself around studying, and then things like mindsets. Do you actually believe that you can do the work? And are you actually going to stick with something when it's difficult? So all of these things are part of what make people successful in college and actually much more successful probably in life in general, whether you're trying to be, whether you're taking calculus for the first time or you are taking up ceramics for the first time. If you're actually willing to stick with it and you come up and you actually have strategies for helping yourself learn, those are things that are going to help you be successful. The final piece is college knowledge, which is something that David Conley has done a lot of work around. And this is just thinking about, like, do students actually know how to get to college, how they know about to make good college choices, and are they good at navigating the systems that they are going to encounter once they get to college? So as we are thinking about academic preparation, and this is a figure that was in Crossing the Finish Line, which came out, a book that came out a couple of years ago, where the authors were thinking about, like, what actually matters more for sixth-year graduation, SAT scores or GPA. Because I think this is one of the things that we have been struggling with, at least, is really thinking about, like, what actually are the right sorts of indicators for thinking about college readiness, and what should schools be paying attention to, and what should people in higher ed be thinking about as they're trying to figure out how to develop their incoming class, and how do they actually think about placement. In this work, they looked at sixth-year college graduation rates by different SAT scores, and these are the sixth-year graduation rates at state colleges in North Carolina. So when we looked at, they broke distance down by SAT scores, controlling for GPA. We're seeing that there's actually not a whole lot of difference in students' probability of graduating from college within 6 years, and this seems really surprising because in many ways SAT was supposed to be designed to determine who was likely to graduate. But once they controlled for GPA and demographics, they're really SAT was not providing a whole lot of additional information. This is in contrast to looking at GPA. So when we look at GPA controlling for SAT scores, there's actually a really big difference just by students who are at who are within one grade point of each other. So if you look at the students who are kind of toward the end, but at the end, 39% of them are graduating within 6 years, and this is compared to 72% of students who graduated from high school with at least a 3.67 GPA. So this is work that we've actually seen that we've had similar results in our work. There's a lot of other people who've had similar findings that it really looks like GPA matters a great deal more than test scores for determining who's going to graduate. So why is this? So this is kind of where the non-cognitive factors and academic tenacity come into play. Because what it looks like here is that grades are measuring something that test scores are not. And test scores are designed to measure concept knowledge and academic skills. And grades are also intended to measure what kids know and what they're able to do. But grades are also capturing the non-cognitive factors or academic tenacity. They're really, teachers are also giving students grades by things like, are they actually engaging in the work? Are they turning in their homework? All these things are incorporated into that. And that tells us a lot more about who's going to graduate from college versus who is not. Than just test scores alone. I realize I'm running out of time here, so I'll try to get through my slides pretty quickly. I'm getting kind of close to the end, so it should be okay. I may run a couple minutes over if that's okay. So another piece of this that is important is college knowledge, and so this is work from Potholes on the Road to College. We were looking at the different stages that students go through in the process of enrolling in college. And this is really kind of showing how students struggle all throughout the whole process. If you're taking kids who are saying that they want to get a four-year degree or higher, only 72% of them are actually responding to a survey and saying that they're planning to attend one in the fall. We're losing more kids when it comes to applications. So even though there are students who are saying that they plan to attend a college, they actually don't apply to a college by June of their senior year. There's also another set of kids who apply but are not accepted, although this is not nearly as big of a drop-off as you might expect, given the fact that in Chicago qualifications tend to be really low. And then we look at students who are actually enrolled, and we see another drop-off here. And work that I'm actually not going to show you, it looks like a piece of this might be financial aid, that there's a lot of kids who are accepted to a four-year college, but they actually, on the same survey, they're saying that they have not actually submitted their FAFSA. So, and this is true of kids across different levels of achievement. So, knowing how to get to college is something that kids really struggle with. And I'll actually have 2 more slides after this, but I think this slide really captures a lot of things that we're thinking about, have been thinking about for a long time, and the work that we're doing right now around college readiness is actually just building off of this, and this slide summarizes a lot of work that we're doing right now. So on this slide, each of these lines represents a college that's commonly attended by Chicago Public School graduates, and it's showing their 6-year graduation rates by their graduating high school GPA, controlling for ACT scores, race, ethnicity, SES, gender, and other demographic characteristics. So the first thing that's really striking, and this is kind of going back with what I was just talking about in terms of GPA, is the fact that, not surprisingly, the higher your GPA, the more likely you are to graduate from college. The second thing that's really notable on this figure is the fact that if you look at kids who graduate from high school with a 2.0, they're unlikely to graduate regardless of where they go to college. So these are kids who you'd probably say are just not college ready. You know, it doesn't matter where they go, what's going on, their probabilities of graduating are really, really low. And then the next thing I think that's even the most striking part about this graph is taking a look at the other end of the spectrum and kids who are graduating with the 4.0 from high school. And this is actually where we're seeing the most variability. So you'd think that a student who graduates from high school with a 4.0 is going to be successful regardless of where they go to school. However, that bottom black line is Northeastern Illinois University. When students who graduate with a 4.0, all things being equal, their probability of graduating from college in 6 years is around 30%. This is compared to students who go to Northwestern University, where it's almost 100% of them are going to be graduating. So, you know, there are probably some issues with selection, but this is part of the follow-up work that we're doing now. And these findings hold. You can take two kids who look the same and who in many ways look college ready, and depending on where they go to college, their probability of attaining a degree is going to vary significantly. So I think this is where this whole concept of college readiness becomes extremely complicated, because if you can take two kids who are identical in all observable ways, and where they go to school is going to really shape a lot whether or not they're going to get a degree, it really makes me wonder, like, is college readiness enough? And we also need to be paying a lot of attention to college choice. So we can't have kids who are going to be so college ready that no matter where they go, we know that they have a almost 100% probability of graduating. So I think this is really makes me think that the concept of college readiness is certainly the responsibility of high schools, but there's also a really big role in thinking about what's going on in higher ed, and why is it that we have kids who have been very successful in high school but may not be nearly as successful in college. I have another slide, but actually I think I'm running out of time, so I can end it right here. So now I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for that very rich presentation. We've had a lot of excellent questions come in. We only have time for a couple minutes of questions, but we will try to get to the rest of the questions with what time we have at the end. One question that we received, for the online reports, do you have a sense of how often schools look at those reports and that they are used?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, it's because, I mean, to be honest, it's like, you know, when we talk to teachers and principals, we're tending to talk to the people who are most data savvy, and those people are looking at them on a regular basis. For the general population, for other teachers who may or may not be as savvy, I don't know. One of the things that I did not mention that's really important to note about this is that CPS really put forth a lot of effort to actually, you know, have PD, to be really to actually try to develop teachers' capacity to be able to actually use this information. So, just having a great data system is not enough. It's really important that it's accompanied by a lot of interaction between the people who are developing these data systems and the users.
Thank you so much. So we will get to some additional questions towards the end of our presentation. I want to introduce our next presenter, Dr. Susan Fairchild, Director of Data Analysis and Applied Research for New Visions. Dr. Fairchild joined New Visions for Public Schools in 2009, where she supervises the development of reporting designed to convey student performance to really a wide variety of audiences. She oversees the implementation of a state-of-the-art student information platform in New Visions schools, and she's going to share this work and practices for educators in using the indicator tools. Welcome, Dr. Fairchild.
Hi, thank you very much. Everybody can hear me okay, I assume. So good afternoon and also good morning. Thank you for inviting me to share some of the work that we are doing here at New Visions. I'm delighted to be here. Let me give a quick rundown of how I will approach the next 20 minutes. First, many of you might be unfamiliar with New Visions for public schools. I'll spend a few minutes talking a little bit about the work that we do here. I'm then going to move right on into our first phase of early warning work that spans from about 2007 until about 2010 and describe some of the core components of that work. And it's pretty important to take a few minutes to talk about phase 1 work if for no other reason than phase 2 builds on it. Our phase 2 work, it really is about the reconceptualization of risk and how that reconceptualization has important implications for how we structure early warning systems and how we think about career and college readiness. And finally, I will end with our new school-level stock and flow tool that we're just beginning to roll out. So let me take a minute just to describe where our data work takes place. New Visions was established in 1989. It's a nationally recognized school reform organization. We're based here in New York City, which is home to approximately 1.1 million public school kids. Many of you might know of New Visions through the small school initiatives that started back in 2001. We helped to open around 100 small schools of choice, and a recent MDRC report found that these small schools have sustained a 10-year, 10 percentage point increase in student graduation rates. In 2007, we became a partnership school organization for New York City's Department of Education. And we currently are providing operational and instructional support for 75 schools in our network. Then, in 2011, we became a charter management organization. So far, we have opened 4 charter schools, and next year we're going to be opening 2 more. So together, our PSO and CMO serve approximately 42,000 students. We're about the size of San Francisco's school district. We primarily work with high schools, and 75% of our students are in small or large high schools. About 14% of our kids are in 6 to 12 years 6 to 12 schools. Here you can see that we serve a fairly high-need student population. In our partnership school organization, our PSO, 77% of our students receive free or reduced price lunch, and in our CMO, that number goes up to about 83%. About 15% of our students are special education, and about 11% are English language learners. About 74% of students in our schools, our PSO schools, are Black and Latino. This goes up to about 95% in our charter schools. From 2007 until 2010, we were focused on putting in place the foundational components of our early warning system. So the problem that we were grappling with was, and of course it continues to be, that when students fail to hit critical benchmarks, everything that we heard Jenny just talk about, the high attendance, the continuous credit accumulation, high grades, the likelihood of them dropping out of high school or not enrolling or persisting in post-secondary institutions increases. I think Jenny did a really beautiful job of really sort of highlighting that. And we know that kids who are on track to graduate by the end of their freshman year are 3.5 times more likely to graduate in 4 years than students who are off track by the end of freshman year. Relatedly, we also know that students who are off track freshman year are more likely to drop out of high school. So the Chicago research really was foundational in terms of us thinking about this problem. But in addition to that, we also know that not graduating on time and failure to hit critical benchmarks, this is made a lot worse when you have continuously changing graduation requirements. New York City's graduation requirements have changed 7 times in the last 11 years. It's made worse when parents and students who, for various reasons, don't know what those graduation requirements are. Here in New York City, English is not the first language of many of our parents and students. And then when school staff don't have access to great data systems, or when the data systems are fragmented, that all of these things compound the problem. So this has been the premise upon which many of our first generation early warning systems have been built. These systems really, or this work is really about integrating data systems so that we are catching students who are on the verge of dropping out, or on the verge, they're on the edge somewhere of not graduating on time. So once we wrapped our heads around this problem, the goal was, okay, how do we make this problem less mysterious for educators, for students, for parents? How do we make this problem visible? How do we combine our core student data, our credits, our grades, our exam scores, in such a way that we're quickly identifying when kids are close to that edge? And this work really reminds me a lot of work that came out of healthcare, the Institute of Medicine, the big important report, To Err is Human, where what they found was medical errors are oftentimes a problem of fragmented systems, people not talking to one another, really basic foundational things. And that is really what reminds me of what we were doing here in this phase 1 work. And one of the things that we did 3 things. The first thing we did is we created clear benchmarks. Then we created multiple tools for multiple audiences. And the other thing you've got to do is you've got to provide data in an integrated system that is real time. And we moved many of our tools over to the Datacation platform. I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. But in short, what we did is we organized ourselves. We put ourselves in order. Think of it like financial accounting. We figured out, okay, where are we in the red? Where are we in the black? Something very fundamental about what we were trying to do in this first phase of work. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about benchmarks. This is the first big piece of work that had to be put into place. It really does underpin most of our data work, and it is a useful, if not somewhat blunt measure that we use to characterize different levels of student achievement within and across our 75 schools, or 77 schools. What we find is that it's pretty sensitive, but it's not very specific. But the rest of this presentation is going to be a little complicated if we don't have a general understanding of how this benchmark system works. So what we did is we created a 4-category color-coded indicator system. This is a traffic light system. So blue, on track to college readiness. Green is on track to graduate based on our high school graduation requirements. Yellow, almost on track, and red is off track. What we're doing in this metric is we are combining overall credit accumulation. We're combining that with our core subject credit accumulation. At the same time, we're also looking at Regents exam scores and semester sequence. This metric is based on evenly paced credit accumulation throughout high school, with students earning 11 credits each year. So the second key element has been the development of data tools that speak to different audiences. What school staff need to see is not necessarily what parents and students need to see or what teachers need to see. We try really hard here at New Visions to make the information that is conveyed in these data tools visually accessible and user-friendly at any level of aggregation, whether or not we're talking about students or whether or not we're talking about principals. So our goal for any stakeholder is to use our data tools to simplify graduation and post-secondary requirements. The goal is to aggregate and disaggregate very easily. It's to facilitate conversations. Here what you're looking at is our college readiness tracker. We took credit accumulation requirements, attendance, college readiness metrics, and put it in a format that is really easy for students and parents to understand. We have seen this tool used over and over again to facilitate conversations between school staff and individual students and parents, namely in support of goal setting and really heightening awareness. Here what you're looking at is our 9th grade tracker. It is often the case that credit and assessment data aren't available until the end of first semester of high school. This is a long time not to intervene. So what we did is we created the 9th grade tracker to capture marking period data and to begin cultivating awareness around the importance of credits, grades, attendance, and exams as it relates to staying on track for graduation. So we wanted our freshmen right from the get-go to be aware of some of these indicators and the importance of these indicators for their future. So by 2010, we really had become victims of our success. We could no longer keep producing these data tools at the rate that schools needed them. So we partnered with Datacation. This was a young group of teachers who developed an innovative technology that had multiple portals, a gradebook, an assessment portal, then also an NCLB reporting portal, a student and parent portal. So we moved all of our data tools over. And I'm happy to say that as of today, we've just released a report on the adoption of Datacation. It has been a rather successful initiative. In 2009, Datacation only had 23 schools. Now it is being used in 400 schools in New York City, 3,000 schools nationally in 5 different states in a pretty short period of time. So we're happy for them. So phase 2, here we're building on all of our phase 1 work. We simply could not reach the place where we are now without all of the time and effort that we put into our core components. So phase 1 was about catching students who are on the edge of something unfortunate happening, like dropping out or not graduating on time. We have been focused on a student at a moment in time, and we have tended to use the word at risk to describe a student at a moment when that symptom has presented or is about to present. Phase 2 is about the interconnectedness of schools and students. All parts of a school are connected. The 9th graders who are at risk of dropping out and the seniors who are at risk of not graduating on time, they are not independent of one another. They vie for the same resources from the same educators in the same school. Phase 2 is beginning to look at the school structures that systematically produce risk and that tend to be less visible than the student who is falling off track. what we just saw, Jenny just put up a very powerful visual of that last slide looking at college choice. Really, the powerful message of that slide is that our academic institutions can both amplify and diminish performance. And we need to really understand the school level here and the role that the school plays in shaping student outcomes. But the other thing that we're doing, and you will find if you read any of our materials, that we are strong believers in system thinking. The other element that we're exploring here is a phenomenon called shifting the burden. What happens when we don't address the root cause and only look to fix immediate problems? Certainly, many of you who are in post-secondary certainly understand the impact of having to remediate kids who graduate and are going into post-secondary careers. This shifting the burden is a very real phenomenon for you all. You know, I think somebody maybe should mute their phone. So just making everybody aware to please mute your phones. There's some background noise. So here we have a basic table representing longitudinal data for a school. We're looking at student achievement across 8 semesters for a single cohort of kids. From first semester all the way to diploma, we see how many numbers of kids are blue or green or yellow or red. It is a basic table, but in the language of system thinking, we're being very specific when we use this word stock. A stock is an accumulation. A stock is a noun. What this table is showing us is an accumulation of achievement that has built up over time. But there are also some limitations with this. As a static moment-in-time measure, stocks don't capture a lot of important information like this, like a student's trajectory. So we can begin to address the deficiencies of a simple 2x2 table by adding data attributes that characterize movement. So intuitively, it's obvious that 2 students who end up earning a Regents diploma might have taken a different pathway to get there. So our stocks, the simple table we looked at on the previous slide, it doesn't capture this movement. So if a stock represents a specific moment in time, then our flows represent the dynamic quality or the movement of students between semesters. From this, we get 2 new attributes, volatility and direction. Volatility is a number of category transitions. Direction tells us whether or not those transitions are up or down. So if you look at that first kid, the kid there on the on track to graduate, we see that first kid has 2 major transitions in second semester and then again between 5th and 6th semester. The second kid has 5 transitions. And so even though they end up at the same place, we clearly see that there's something dramatically different happening with these 2 kids that you're not going to get if you're just simply looking at your stocks. And, you know, I could be wrong, but I feel like this slide in particular helps to visualize what Jenny means when she talks about the predictive power of the GPA. That GPA is sort of inherently getting at volatility and direction. Now what we can do is we can take a slice and we can look at the movement between semesters. For this example, we're looking at movement between the 3rd and 4th semester. We see in this visual the kids moving up and kids moving down. This visual alone gives us a whole new appreciation for at-risk and vulnerability. We traditionally define at-risk as the red kids and also the yellow kids because of their close proximity to the red off-track kids. But when we look at this visual, we clearly see that all kids are at risk, but in different ways and at different moments in time. The yellow kid who moves up to green is hardly out of the woods. This student is at risk of not being able to maintain and sustain that progress. The blue on-track college-ready kid who moves down to green is certainly at risk and is showing evidence of lower performance. The green on-track kid who moves up to blue is at risk of not being able to sustain that momentum. So there are a lot of different scenarios that we as educators need to be very mindful of. Now, when we begin to combine our stock and our flow, we have a lot more information. If we look at that almost on-track category, we went from 32 kids, we went from 32 kids at the end of third semester to 52 kids in this category by the end of fourth semester. But now we can clearly see that the increase in yellow at the end of semester 4, it's not the result of the red off-track kids moving up, but it is a result of the green and the blue students moving down. That is a really powerful piece of information. And then when we put it all together, stocks and flows produce an important perspective for schools. We see the continuity and the flow of student progress over time. This chart here that you're looking at, it represents a single cohort of students. When we begin to compare these progress to graduation maps over time for multiple cohorts, we begin to see something rather profound. By comparing different cohorts, that is, by looking at these different maps and holding them up next to one another, schools can begin to identify where interventions are needed for the subsequent cohort. These maps begin to show the presence of feedback loops in a school that are driving school and student performance. We're giving this the rather dramatic name of structural volatility. And let me just explain that for a minute. Structural volatility, it is a feedback loop. A feedback loop is a closed system. That is, it captures a circular relationship where X causes Y, which then loops back around and causes X. This is different from the linear relationship, which says X causes Y. So what this means is that school structures shape student performance, which then shapes school structures. It means that schools influence students, and then students influence schools, and this is a loop, and it goes, one reinforces the other. It also means that schools induce student movement, and this is both purposeful and inadvertent. For example, a purposeful intervention is when a school adopts intensive credit recovery for seniors who are at risk of not graduating on time. This intervention also has inadvertent or unintended consequences because we are so busy making sure our seniors graduate on time, we unintentionally draw resources away from our freshmen, sophomores, and juniors. All parts of a school are connected. So we have recently developed a prototype stock and flow tool. I'm going to spend a few minutes walking through this tool. It's interactive, and it's up on our New Visions website along with several blogs and reports that document this tool. I'm presenting it to you in a PowerPoint format, so we are going to lose some of that interactivity. And I should also note that we are moving this tool as we speak into datacation so that it reaches a much wider audience. So if you were to go onto our website, this is what you would see. You would see this tool, and you would have the opportunity to click on About the Tool, which provides some documentation about what it is. You could click on Behind the Metrics. This gives us a nice breakdown of what those metrics are that underpin this tool, and a little bit of which I spoke about earlier. You can explore the data. This is real data that schools and others can access so that you can really go in and you can see how from one semester to the next, school and student performance has changed over time. And then apply the tool. Here what we're trying to do is to offer ideas on how to actually use this tool in practice. So if we were to click on the about the tool, one of the first things that we see is how this tool implements our college readiness metric. Here you can clearly see how the different colors represent student performance categories. You might note that we have expanded those categories from 4 to 6. Really what we found was that yellow, that almost on track, was pretty wide. So we wanted to break it down a little bit more and make the tool a little bit more sensitive. And here what you see, you can click around in the tool, and for instance in this example you can see how the width of the color band represents percentages of students within a performance category. So you can see this really nice example of that 33.7. You can see how those kids are really draining and moving into that red off-track category. Likewise, you can see that there's a certain percentage of kids up in the green band that are flowing out and moving into a lower performance category. At the same time, we also see a substantial number of green kids who stay green. And here we see a little bit of information on our metric. And by clicking on, you can literally see how the metric is calculating and how it links to a certain moment in time in a stock flow map. But I should also say this is actually a pain point for us that we're still debating internally. The changes in our graduation requirements here in New York City are the result of phasing out what we call the local diploma. This was not a rigorous diploma, and it certainly needed to be phased out. And this phase out has happened over the last 4 or 5 years. But this also has really important implications for our metric and how to fairly present longitudinal data. For instance, do we use today's metric for students that graduated back in 2008, even though those kids who graduated back then had different graduation requirements? I mean, there's some pros and cons to both. I mean, for standardization purposes and being able to really look across multiple years of data, it's awfully helpful to have the same metric across. But at the same time, it's not an entirely fair comparison. So you can imagine, it's endless hours of fun for us here at New Visions debating this. And here's a screenshot of an example of how you can apply the tool. We have a few different scenarios up on our website, but in this particular screenshot, we are asking school leaders to think about the following. So when you look at this map, where are you seeing large flows of students draining from a higher performance category into a lower performance category? What interventions or policies at a school level can potentially stop that draining? And we can see that this draining happens at different moments in time, reinforcing the point I made earlier that all kids are vulnerable, but in different ways and at different moments in time. So the next logical question is, why are so many kids draining? And this brings us to the work with Datacation that we're currently engaged with and moving this tool over into their platform, where the power of functionality, really being able to click and drill down and have students pop up, that's the next level of iteration that this tool will be undergoing soon. So I want to go ahead and end my presentation here and open it up for any questions.
Thank you so much, Susan, for such an in-depth presentation. Again, we've got a great amount of questions that we're not going to be able to get to all of them. One question was, how do you make sure schools with limited understanding of data know how to use the stock and flow charts? Oh,
that's a good question. I mean, that defines all of the data work that we do here at New Visions, and we have a lot of different mechanisms for working with educators. The first thing that we have is we have what we've called the Data Specialist Network. I think that it's the only one of its kind here in New York City. So many years ago, the Department of Education mandated that all schools have a data specialist. So one of the things that we did is we tried to convene monthly sessions with these folks, seeing them as folks who can turnkey in the schools, and we train them and work with them, 8 or 9 times throughout the year, and we're very available to them, constantly. So that's one mechanism. The other is we have convenings where we begin to have the conversation. And I also want to just keep in mind with something like stock and flow, we have a lot of documentation, and really we're going to be able to track when we roll it out in Datacation the extent to which it's used and how people are able to make meaning from it. And we've begun to pilot it with a few of our principals who have given us really good feedback.
Great, thank you. A second question was, what role is there for post-secondary institutions in supporting this work? And I'm hoping that, Jenny, you might also provide a quick response to this as well.
Well, one of the things that we hope to do as a stock flow tool is to extend it into post-secondary. I think the most important thing, for instance, that we have to remember is shifting the burden happens both ways. High schools can shift the burden over to post-secondary. At the same time, elementary and middle schools shift the burden over to high schools. The way I see it, high schools, they are a last line of defense. If we're not able to really help these kids at this moment in time, then their opportunities in post-secondary really become much more limited, that their opportunities have narrowed significantly if we can't reverse some of the performance gaps in high school. But I also want to say that once it gets to high school, what was once a chronic problem starting all the way from kindergarten, it is now an acute problem. So I see that this problem of kids being off track represents a systematic, across our entire district, it is a systematic problem, and it's not something that an individual school can necessarily change for the entire system. And I think that in terms of what post-secondary schools can do, it's being very aware of the good hard work that's happening in our high schools right now and continuing to have the conversation about what are the appropriate indicators and metrics that those of us in high school need to be looking at. And here I think Jenny can certainly add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting area because I feel like in a lot of ways, I've talked a lot about how GPA is more predictive than test scores for who's going to be successful in college and who's going to get a college degree, but I feel like there's still a lot that we just don't know about why it is that two kids who seem to be the same coming out of high school have really different outcomes when they hit college campuses. So this is maybe the researcher in me where I feel like this is something that we really need to be doing a lot more work on, but I think it's also a big place where post-secondary institutions really also need to be thinking about, why is it that some kids are successful, and why some kids are not, when it's not always something that can be identified looking at what their college applications look like. So I would hope once we have a better idea of what actually it is, and I mean there certainly are risk factors that we know about, whether when students are part-time, if they're working outside of school. I know there's any number of ways we can sort of identify risk factors, but I think what we actually want would be something that would be roughly the equivalent of an on-track to college graduation. So, so I think there's a lot of work that could be done on the research side and the practice side to start to really know what it is that puts students at risk when they hit college campuses of not actually graduating, and then developing data systems and having colleges go through the same sort of process that's going on in the New Vision schools and in Chicago, where they're actually thinking about students in a systematic way and really trying to help them be successful when they're there.
Thank you both so much. I do want to share with our participants that these are additional resources that you can use to find out more about our presenters' work. And again, you'll be receiving this PowerPoint as well as a survey that we'd love you to respond to. If you need further information on REL Northwest and our alliance, please feel free to contact Jacqueline or I. Thank you again to our presenters for a wonderful conversation. We look forward to continuing this dialogue in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.